The important thing to note with this video is that you're not stopping when you get to the end of chapter 10. That would be a very, very short day of work for you. You'll carry this video on into working with the first half of chapter 11. I want you to start. There's a link in the lesson itself here in chapter 10. Watch this video. I think there's credits at the end, so it really should be truly 4 minutes. This quick introduction to the War of 1812. It will go through all kind of the major events. You'll notice a lot of the things I talk about in notes, but watch that to get class started, and then you'll resume with finishing up the back part of chapter 10 here. Of course, there's obviously a pause button, so if you ever get behind or like I missed that bullet or whatever, you're pretty smart kids. You can figure that out. Last class was all about the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, and today we're going to talk about America's fourth president, the writer of the Bill of Rights, father of the Constitution, author of Federalist Papers. He's going to come back around from Virginia, and James Madison is going to become America's fourth president, and he is going to win 2 elections, so he'll be an 8-year presidency. Now, he's got a lot of problems on his plate when he takes over office. All of those trade restrictions and those issues with France and England that Jefferson, let's put it mildly, was having problems with at the end of his second term, Madison's going to pick up on that. And Madison's proposal and that string of policies is known as, it's kind of a mouthful, is Macon's Bill number 2. And the thought under the Congress with James Madison was we needed to offer, with our issues with France or England, get an exclusive trade partnership with at least one of them. And then we'll have a major European power that we're actually willing to trade with. We'll trade with everyone else. And then we're going to cut out one of them from our trade to kind of stick it to them because of the issues we've been having on the seas with both of them. Now, here's the issue. Napoleon, in charge of France at the time, is cunning. And he says, all right, we'll take you up on your offer for Macon's Bill, and agrees France and U.S. are going to have an exclusive trade relationship. Now, for Napoleon, there's nothing serious to this for him. If France and the U.S. have a great trade partnership, awesome. If he wants to betray his word in a year, he'll be able to do that. He doesn't necessarily respect the U.S. And most importantly, he realizes by accepting Macon's Bill, the U.S. will have to turn their back to England and have an increased amount of tension with them country to country. So Madison is kind of put in a corner. He accepts Napoleon's offer of exclusive trade, but he knows he can't totally trust Napoleon. And the acceptance of Napoleon's offer is going to make the British increasingly mad at the U.S. So because of this, we place a permanent trade embargo on the British, work out an agreement with the French, but it doesn't solve the issue that is at the root of all of this back to Jefferson's presidency, which is America is having issues gaining respect of all the European powers, particularly in trade. And now moving forward, Britain and us are at odds with each other economically and politically, despite the revolution being long over. Out in the Midwest, parts of the South that Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, a lot of the places that were new and developing states in the early 1800s. As those states entered into Congress and had representation, there became growth of a group of people known as war hawks, who were American politicians that were kind of a new generation. They were younger. They were associated with being younger, more fiery, more willing to go to war, wanting to obtain more land, and less from the old school approach of compromise that we learned about with the 1790s in chapter 9. Now, to counter that, Tecumseh, and I'll try my best here, Tenskwatawa, his brother, who's otherwise known as the Prophet, they are Shawnee brothers. That's a tribe, and they wanted to form, and they do form a confederacy. Might think of the Iroquois here a little bit, a kind of a loosely but still connected group of several native tribes east of the Mississippi, particularly in places like modern-day Michigan, even a little bit of Indiana, Ohio areas. Those areas would have been closely associated with the Shawnee. And what they promote, especially Tecumseh and the Prophet, are everything that goes against what the Warhawks want, which is westward expansion. The Shawnee promote going back and respecting their native cultures and not assimilating to the United States culture. And probably the biggest that I've underlined here is they had the policy of refusing to sell lands to what they would have seen as encroachment from Americans. And that would have been the source of a lot of the tension between this growing in power Shawnee Confederacy and the Americans that are pouring out of the areas that you would know as the original 13 colonies. A lot of concern also came, if you remember the Battle of Fallen Timbers in the 1790s, there was increased concern that British Canadians and some of the forts that were still around and lingering after the American Revolution, that they would team up, the British Canadians and the British that were left in America, that they would team up with the Shawnee Confederacy and be a large problem for the growing United States. This all comes to a head, yes, before the War of 1812, when William Henry Harrison advances on the prophet. Tecumseh's away looking for more allies, which is why he's not here at this battle. And famously, modern day West Lafayette, which is where very close to the University of Purdue, there is a battle at Prophetstown, which was the name of the Shawnee area, called the Battle of Tippecanoe. William Henry Harrison gets a big victory for America, and the Shawnees are routed, and I believe the prophet is killed at this battle as well. This forced Tecumseh's hand, who was not present at the battle, to have to seek out more direct alliance and support from the British. It's interesting. This is a route for America, and the Prophetstown is burned to the ground. But nowadays in West Lafayette, there's a Prophetstown State Park. There's a middle school named after Tecumseh. I actually student taught at William Henry Harrison High School near Purdue. So it's a clear kind of beat down of the Shawnee Confederacy, but hey, we'll name a middle school off of one of your leaders. Sometimes you'll see places that say the Shawnee were discredited here, and I don't know if that's entirely fair. I think in the American public mind, because they were seen as an enemy and they would have to later team up with the British, that they were discredited that way. I'm sure if you could go in a time machine and interview Tecumseh and his brother before this battle, I think they might have a different approach to the word credit with the relationship and the histories of Native Americans with European colonization, even going all the way back to the Powhatans and the Pequot War and things like that. So I see discredit oftentimes with this battle, and I don't know if that's entirely in a fair historical depiction. But I'll get off my soapbox and carry on. By the spring of 1812, the economic conflict with the British, as well as the budding relationship and issues out in the modern day Midwest, if you will, are getting worse and worse. And President Madison feels that war with the British is inevitable, primarily because of these reasons: pressure from the Warhawk faction in Congress, issues with trade, as I previously mentioned, and as I described on the last slide, the teaming up of potentially the British and native groups out west, causing problems for the United States. Some people felt at the time that another war was needed for America to prove itself on the international stage. Basically, the thought was the revolution was kind of a fluke, and America hadn't really proved itself as a legitimate nation yet in warfare. The vote in Congress, by the way, is very, very narrow. It is not like a massive majority vote that says we should get into this war with the British. In fact, people up in New England, where the Federalist stronghold was very present, they had been most affected by the trade policies. They were more sympathetic and saw the British as what should have been an ally. And there's even examples in New England after war was declared on the British of New Englanders flying American flags at half staff because they were so distraught by the fact that we had declared war on the British. So the vote was narrow. It was certainly not unanimous. All right, you're finished with chapter 10 now. You should be transitioning over to chapter 11. I think I'm going to have the link included here regardless, as a second time in case you close this YouTube video. Pick up right where you're at this point with the review once you have a copy made of Chapter 11. You're going to get a break from my voice, pause video, kind of like what you did with the primary source thing with Washington's farewell address. These two topics can get confusing. You may have pretended to just listen to me describe all of them and remember a few of them from last class when we were in person, but it's always good for you to have a check. So pause this, answer these two questions. It's kind of a self-check kind of deal. You also have a picture of where we're at in our curriculum currently in APUS history. So resume this video when you're ready to answer these questions. Now you're ready for slide 1 of chapter 11. The War of 1812 is kind of chaotic, honestly, would be the word I would use. And I'll talk about this when we get to the Treaty of Ghent. It kind of solves nothing in a way. At the beginning of it, America's army was very weak, very scattered, and spread out all over the place. It was not nearly as organized as the U.S. military is today, for example. Allegedly, the British were going to be weak in Canada. So there's all this energy with the war declared of, hey, once again, like we did in the Revolution, let's invade Canada and expand our territory. But America's repelled 3 separate times. And the British and natives are energized on this. Long story short, America does not get off to a great start in this war. Now, there are some successes. I think this is part of a study guide question. Henry Harrison once again earns a big victory, and he's starting to build on his hero status in America. He wins a big battle at the Battle of Thames, which I believe is actually modern-day Canada. And this is where Tecumseh, the great leader of the Shawnee Confederacy, is killed. Thomas MacDonough, not to be outdone, wins a major battle at Lake Champlain in New York. It's so odd, people's depictions of War 1812. I've seen places describe this battle as life-saving and may have prevented New England from separating from the United States, which would have been absolutely crazy. And then I've also seen things depict this as maybe this battle wasn't even significant to the end result, since negotiations to end the war were already ongoing. So it's really a mixed bag what you see and how it's described with this war. So it can be skewed, what was a major battle and what was not. I always find that a little fascinating. If you don't know this, how our national anthem came to be written, and also the fact that the British actually burned Washington, D.C., our capital, including Congress and the White House. Thankfully, America held firm at Fort McHenry in Baltimore, which is right next door to what was our brand new Washington, D.C. at the time. Francis Scott Key, at the Battle of Fort McHenry, as an onlooker and observer, famously wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, which is 4 verses. Obviously, one verse in particular is incredibly famous and was adopted formally. Actually took a while, not until the 1930s was it adopted as our national anthem. But that is where you get the land of the free, home of the brave, and all of that we sing before sporting events, and certainly take a lot of pride in as Americans. Down in New Orleans, which I know is very far away from D.C., Andrew Jackson, future 7th president and controversial figure, he led a jigsaw group of sailors and militiamen and Frenchmen and even some black soldiers in kind of a crazy upset victory over the British in the city of New Orleans, way down south. It's kind of wild. I believe this battle was fought after the peace treaty over in Belgium was signed. So it kind of had not like a huge effect on like end results, but it was a ragtag mixed bag of Americans led by a budding hero and future political star. So it had significance that way, even though the timing of it really didn't have a massive impact in the war's results. Again, War of 1812, a really, really strange war in America's history in a lot of ways. Over on the right, you can see a map of some of the major events. So much of the War of 1812 was focused in really the borders of the Great Lakes and American territory in Canada. Over on the left, you have the iconic story depicted of Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife, when the White House was getting burned. She famously, the story goes, saved a portrait of George Washington out of the White House because they knew the British were on their way to destroying the city, more or less. Now, New England was very frustrated. Generally speaking, the Federalist stronghold was very frustrated with the War of 1812, and they were most impacted by all those trade restrictions and the embargoes on the British at the end of Jefferson and start of Madison's presidencies. So there was a lot of deceit even within the politicians that represented the New England states. And that is all going to come together at something called the Hartford Convention, which was in Connecticut. And this is a big deal because it was American politicians meeting together in secret from basically the group of what you would know as the New England states: Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and then Vermont, which had been added after the Revolution. This is a nail in the coffin for the death of the Federalist Party, which is going to fizzle out by the 1820s, because meeting in secret is going to be a bad look to the American public, and two, the way they present their demands is like right after the Battle of New Orleans and the War of 1812 has ended. So they end up, I saw the phrase, end up just looking like a bunch of crybabies, even though, let's hear in a second, the demands that they come up with are not completely unreasonable, but their timing and the secret delegation of doing it came off publicly as very nefarious and maybe unprofessional, for lack of a $5 word. I think in your notes, I have you writing two of these things down. These were the key demands that these New England congressmen and senators wanted to propose. And a lot of them, getting rid of the 3/5 clause, the president should only serve one term, so more restrictive on presidential power, preventing, because Virginia had a dynasty going, if you will, preventing the president coming from the same state more than a couple times in a row, the abolition of slavery, and some other things. So, in hindsight, their demands were not wildly unreasonable, but as I said on the slide before, the timing of them was seen as unreasonable, and it's with their leaders kind of gone from the 1790s, the Federalist Party is fizzling out at this point. I mentioned it verbally, I think, a few minutes ago, but of all places, the War of 1812 is settled in Belgium with the Treaty of Ghent in December of 1814. Like I said, the War of 1812 is strange. No territory was conquered by either side, the British or the U.S., by the end of the war. Everything was just restored to its original owners on either side. The treaty has no mention of natives, trade restrictions, or impressment on the seas of American sailors, aka kind of like all of the main issues that caused the war, not really in the treaty. If anything, the War of 1812, it's a tie, it's a stalemate, and I've seen the phrase, not 1 inch of territory lost or gained. It wasn't a pointless war, as the slide I'm going to show you here in a second, but in terms of expansion or defeat and success in conquering, the War of 1812, in that sense, not exactly monumental in American history. So why does it matter? Okay, if nothing was gained, nothing was lost, what's the impact? What's the lesson here? Why did you even teach us this? 6,000 Americans killed. That's kind of a footnote internationally. There's so much bigger things going on in Europe with Napoleon at this time, so it can't be that. What's our lesson here? Okay, number one, like I said, the revolution in some ways maybe kind of a fluke. America got lucky. France helped us. It showed by ourselves America could resist a big foreign power in Britain. Certainly we didn't conquer them, but we didn't lose to them either. So in a sense, there's a moral victory and kind of like we earned credit on the national stage since because of that. Two, a sense of nationalism, patriotism, pride in America really grew because of what I just talked about, was standing our ground against a international power. War heroes like William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson are going to come out of this war and eventually spin both of those, or each of them are going to spin that into winning the presidency down the road. Also, a lesson, as I just described with the Hartford Convention, the Federalists are kind of exposed, not necessarily for being having horrible political ideas, but their timing, their popularity is dwindling. Maybe there's fallout still from the Alien and Sedition Acts, along with their lack of support of the war. You're going to move into a stage where there's basically only one political party in the United States. America, sorry, I have one more bullet here. America now, with the Louisiana Purchase in hand, the War of 1812 over, is going to continue to look west and expand into the United States that we know today. Nationalism is going to grow. I mentioned that in the last slide. Really, for the first time, we will start having authors that write fiction and stories that are connected with America. Up to this point, really great writings in the U.S. were all political based, nonfiction. You might think of the Federalist Papers or Common Sense, but names like Washington Irving and James Cooper. Irving wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow with the Headless Horseman. You might know it around, Halloween and stuff like that. The Capitol, there were plans to rebuild it. We expand our military. Things like the North American Review begin writing histories and publicizing different humanities-based academic works. And Mr. Hart, I don't really care, but why does this matter? It's American things written by Americans. We're not borrowing our arts from Europe anymore. We're our own distinct country with our own writers and our own creators, and that's big to building kind of a social identity in the United States as well, moving through the 19th century. Couple slides left, you're almost there. Henry Clay starts to emerge. He's a really prominent Kentucky politician, both in the House and then eventually the Senate. He runs for president a couple of times in the 1800s. And coming out of the War of 1812, the tariff is taxes on foreign imports is increased significantly, partially in protection of U.S. industry that was really still struggling to keep up with cheaper European goods. So I think it started 8% under Hamilton. This jacks up the tariff policy to a much higher pricing of 20 to 25%. Again, for this one, primarily to protect U.S. industry. Henry Clay is also associated, and it goes bigger than just him, the proposal of something called the American system, which kind of connects to this wave of nationalism going on in the U.S. And in it, it's kind of federalist in nature, even though Henry Clay isn't associated with the Federalist Party, which has fizzled at this point. But it promoted the idea of a strong American banking system, the protective tariff that I just described to you, as well as a national funded network of roads and canals. And all of this is hotly debated in Congress. A lot of people kind of go back to the national bank arguments of none of this was given to the federal government as a specific power in the Constitution. So I'm not sure we're allowed to do this. And as an example of that, the Erie Canal, which would fit into that network of national transportation, it wasn't made by the federal government or funded by the federal government, but some individual states still promoted the idea of increasing transportation, which is exemplified by the creation of the very famous, you can see a picture here, Erie Canal that was completed by the state of New York, not the federal government. So this idea of nationally done things, whether it be banking, tariff, roads, and canals, controversial with a lot of people that favored states' rights, but guys like Henry Clay began to push for it to build a strong American infrastructure. James Monroe continues and is the last of the Virginia dynasty, going back to Washington. Adams was from Massachusetts, but then Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, all Virginia presidents. And he's going to usher in what's known as, and I put it in quotes, the era of good feelings. And yes, this era, late 18 teens and the 1820s, is known for having only one prominent political party, the Democrat Republican. So Sometimes historians in a glowy view of U.S. will say that meant America was totally united at the time, and we did have prosperity and growth coming out of the War 1812. But era of good feelings, it deserves its quotations as maybe a little bit of an over the top phrase. You have all kinds of tensions brewing with the tariff. Southerners really didn't like it, generally speaking. The bank issue is still a problem. The selling of public land out west. You have developing sectionalism with different factions across the United States. And yes, a topic that needs addressing, and we'll have plenty of it moving forward, is that issue of slavery. It's not going away. It's still there, and the half-hearted compromises and the circling around the issue, even back to the Constitutional Convention, that topic has not been resolved. So that is going to rear its ugly head, even in the so-called era of good feelings. Of one video you can watch at the end of things about the era of good feelings to kind of wrap up the work for chapter 9. Your only homework would be, and I'll just load it for you here, is, we've been out of this for a while with all of our team stuff, but we need to get back into shape, if you will. This is obviously the original view-only version. Back into shape, if you will, with individual chapter study guides. So if your version of the study guide in time period 4 is looking like the original, let's maybe take some time, if we have it, I'm sure you will in class today, to start working on that. And if not, let's at least through the portion of chapter 11 that I covered just now, have all of those study guides filled out before your next class, which I guess for you, period 5, will be Tuesday. Thanks for following along, and I will see you next week.